There is no executive order that can take away Indigenous Peoples Day. And if you're looking at the clock, don't worry, I edited. Today, I want to tell a few stories, my own reflections on and my own learning around Indigenous people's heritage, and to give some historical context. And I am in no way an expert. And I want to invite you into your own deeper learning and reflection. And then at the end of the service in the receiving line, I have a notebook here that says recommendations and resources for continued learning. So if you're sitting there thinking, what is she talking about? She should read this book. Tell me about it, okay? I grew up in Racine, Wisconsin, which was the land of the, I know we've got another, can you believe it? Also another Racine native right here in the front row. So maybe we can commiserate on this. We had, or celebrate. It was the land of the Ho-Chunk people, and there were a couple tribes around the Great Lakes. And the state of Wisconsin actually has done a pretty good job in involving Native Americans in celebrating culture and awareness. We had lots of school assemblies in the 80s and 90s, school assemblies with people from the tribes who would teach us about their culture and dances and traditional dress. There were state gatherings, and there was always something at the county fair or the state fairs. We were always learning, sort of immersed in this knowledge of the history of our place. And on one school field trip, I have this distinct memory of, that kind of feeling when you're a kid where you feel a little shame or you learn something new and you hit the profound thing, but you don't quite know how to process it because you're 9. So I was in a museum, and there was a taxidermied bald eagle. And some other kid said, "That's illegal." I was like, "That's illegal? What?" And then kind of gave this speech about how bald eagles are protected for the Native Americans in Wisconsin, and that it was illegal for anybody to even touch, or in my 9-year-old mind, it's you can't even look at a bald eagle. And you certainly, if you ever found a bald eagle hurt or something, you weren't to interfere with it, and if you ever found an eagle feather or something, you could never do that. And I just held on to that so tightly, this weird thing for me as a 9-year-old, and then maybe 10 years later, I was like, is that true? I don't know. And so I looked it up, and it sort of is true. It sort of is true. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service established a national eagle repository, and they have a system since the 70s where bald eagles are kept for tribal practices. And so there's different parts of a bald eagle, different parts of the feathers, the tail feathers, the wing feathers. They all have different meaning, and in fact, they are kind of held sacred by the U.S. government in a repository, and then different Native American tribes can make a request for pieces of these bald eagles that are, if they're found injured or dead, in a highway or side of a road. But so that 9-year-old in me understood something really important about symbols and about the bald eagle, but about this larger whole that I couldn't quite understand. And yet, I grew up feeling like I was pretty knowledgeable about Native Americans. I had all these school assemblies, after all. In fact, of course, I was not. It was in the 2010 General Assembly, Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, that Winona LaDuke gave a lecture, and at that time she was the executive director of Honor the Earth, an indigenous-led organization that fights to dismantle settler colonialism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism. And it was then that I began to really face the realities of the doctrine of discovery, that European principle from the 15th century that ignores human and legal rights of indigenous peoples. In the United States in 1823, the Supreme Court used the doctrine of discovery for the basis of its decision in Johnson v. Emmentosh decision. And they say the discovery gave, discovery meaning the discovery of the lands, gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy either by purchase or by conquest. It is part of our history. European settlers came here, and as they moved west, they continued to move Native communities off of their lands, away from their families. The U.S. government offered treaties that they always intended to break. They forced assimilation. They removed children from their families. This is the history of our country, and there is always so much to learn. I had an opportunity to do what's called a Sacred Sites tour in Minnesota a couple years ago. I was there in April. There was snow on the ground, as happens in Minnesota. The tour was led by Jim Bear Jacobs, a member of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, which is located in central Wisconsin. These tours are given through storytelling and experiences and reflection and silence. Our visit centered around the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers in a place that the Dakota referred to as Bedote, or the meeting place of rivers. We gathered in a parking lot, and as Jim Bear began his introduction to the group, a bald eagle circled above us. And he paused in reverence, and my 9-year-old self was, I know what's happening. So he paused and he said, the ancestors are present. And he watched the bald eagle, and we all watched the bald eagle, and we all felt the holiness of that moment, and he waited until the bald eagle flew off to start our tour. It was absolutely a holy moment. And we continued our tour into this beautiful spot where the meeting place of the rivers with these beautiful bluffs and these trees. And we learned the Dakota legend that the first peoples of the tribe came from those rocks, and that above us in the sky was a river of ancestors. And then we learned about the settlers in the 1800s and the 5-week conflict in 1862 known as the Dakota War. We sat on cold stones and of a modern memorial that had been set up to learn about broken treaties and how the Dakota people were tricked out of their lands. And we learned about the concentration camp that had been built on that spot in the winter of 1862. Over 1,600 Dakota peoples were held there, mostly women, children, and the elderly, and hundreds died over the winter, and those that survived were forced to move on to Nebraska. At that moment, Minnesota made it illegal for the Dakota people to live in the state with the Dakota Expulsion Act, and that law has not yet been repealed. There I was, 41 years old, standing in the snow, thinking I knew some stuff. I knew none of this. And Jim Bear invited us to walk to where the camp had been and reflect on our own experiences there, and I felt the devastation of that spot, the tragedy of families. And at that moment, I committed to hearing more stories and to learning more. I was surprised when my next learning encounter came in my daughter's preschool class. So I was volunteering one day, and I guess it was around Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm organizing papers in the office, and in the other classroom I hear, in 1492, da, 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 da. And I thought, that's odd. I haven't heard that in poem in a long time. I think it's been kind of out of favor to talk about Columbus for at least a decade. But here these 3- and 4-year-olds were reading this picture book, celebrating what happened in 1492. And I thought, oh, Am I supposed to say something to the teacher? That's going to be awkward, but it feels like a weird moment. But that's fine because the kids saved the day. They applied a critical reading to that text that I had to be taught in college. One kid, 3-year-old, says, "Why aren't they wearing any clothes? Are they going swimming?" What a great question on the stereotype of the Native American folks that we put in images. And then another 4-year-old asked the most important question: how could he discover something if people were already there? So the kids are all right. They got this. So when my daughter came home, we had a little conversation about the reality. She's 4, or she was 3 at the time. It was a little hard to know what to say, but we talked about how that really wasn't accurate in some of the consequences and the devastations that happened. And so a year later, I got a call from the teacher because my daughter was disruptive. Because at 4 years old, the teacher was, thank you, right? She was reading the same book again, and the teacher relates this, that my daughter told everyone that actually Columbus was really mean and had made everyone sick and stolen all their toys. And the teacher thought it really wasn't appropriate for my daughter to be saying that. And I said, well, I think it's the truth. And it really probably isn't appropriate to be teaching anything other than the truth these days. And to her credit, she did appreciate the opportunity to learn and reflect. And as I understand it, the next year, she did find a different book to read. So thank you. We are all learning, but and you never know where these moments come, and is that some profound thing? No, but how do we prepare ourselves and be ready to offer feedback to the teacher or talk to the 4-year-old about the truth? I appreciate an opportunity to learn a little bit about the Piscataway Conoy people here, the lands of this, ancestral lands of this area, and I hope that you will too. If you haven't already, they have a website, so I'm going to kind of skip a little bit of that. But their story starts in this website. They talk about the modern story, meeting the first European settlers in 1608, and very quickly by 1666 they already had a treaty for a reservation for the people who were here. And it was in the 1970s that the Piscataway lobbied to form themselves, and also for the state of Maryland to form the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs. And it took nearly 20 years then for the state of Maryland to recognize the Piscataway Conoy tribe officially in January of 2012. It's pretty good. And the Piscataway Conoys around, you might see them at your own state fairs or county fairs or social events, or they have a great relationship with the Maryland parks. So we've heard from many Native American groups over the time that we non-natives need to sort this out, to learn and reflect, to grieve on our own, to understand ourselves and our histories and our relationships, and then commit to building genuine relationships, to supporting efforts, and to support efforts without taking space in the leadership. So I want to share just a few things about Unitarian Universalists that we have been working on, Native American treaty rights and justice issues and changing sports mascots since the 1970s. Unitarian Universalists have been really committed to this. Of course, there's always more that we can do. In 2009, the UUA president then, Bill Sinkford, offered an apology to the Ute people for mistreatment by Unitarians, because in 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant invited Christian denominations to take over the management of reservations and agencies and schools. And the American Unitarian Association accepted the charge over a district covering Colorado with various tribes of the Ute, consisting of about 8,000 people. As the history writes it, we were pretty bad at that, which I guess is something to be proud of. And so the Unitarian history is still not great, but it only lasted a couple years, our sort of influence there. And a member of the Ute tribe was president of one of the General Assemblies to have a conversation. The Canadian Unitarian Council had their own Truth and Healing and Reconciliation Initiative. They wrote a formal letter to the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2014, and they have taken very intentional steps towards learning and healing within their context. In 2016, over 50 Unitarian Universalist clergy answered the call to go to Standing Rock in solidarity and prayer with the Standing Rock Sioux Nation over the Dakota Access Pipeline. And as Reverend Michael said, that actually right now, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Reverend Dr. Sophia Bentoncourt, is in Arizona at Oak Flat with the Apache people, standing to protect that site and that religious significance. So I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead a couple pages. There's so much to learn, so many histories, so many unique stories, unique people. Just ask. That was our message. Open the hand. Thank you for singing that. And I believe that we can do this. One teacher, Tinker, took a workshop. He's a professor at Iliff School of Theology and also a member of the Osage Nation. And he talked about his teaching philosophy was to stir up the mud in the pond so that students need to sort it out in a new way. And that's what it feels like to me. Every time I learn something, learn a new piece of this history, learn about a new tribe, learn about a new place, it stirs up the pond again, and I sort out how the world is organized. I invite you to join in some of this reflection and this learning, and to help, remember, to add your own learning too. For the past 3 years, my office, the Global Connections Office, has collaborated with Meadville Lombard Theological School to offer a learning series that we call Post-Imperial Futures. And we hear different folks in the field talking and reflecting on decolonization. It's free, it's open to all. We're going to do something in the spring. You're all invited. For me, I think that Indigenous learning has become a spiritual practice of sorts, something that I do with intention, something that I believe will grow my spirit and my connection to the larger whole. If you have a spiritual practice, I invite you this weekend, this Indigenous Peoples Weekend, to integrate, to weave in some piece of reflection around Indigenous peoples into your journaling, your yoga, your morning walk. And if you don't have a spiritual practice, I invite you just to find a quiet moment or 10 minutes on Google and learn something new. Learn something this Indigenous Peoples Day. Find out about the histories of the places that you have called home. Find out about the land back movement, or the doctrine of discovery and its consequences, about how Native Americans were counted in the census. If you don't know, there's this website, native-land.ca, and you can enter your address, and it will tell you about the different Indigenous groups that have been on that particular point for generations. Friends, we Unitarian Universalists believe that we can transform the world with our love. May that love open us to possibilities. May that love deepen our commitment to learning, and may that love inspire us to action.